All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and do introductions and welcome everybody. First, I do want to say to everyone who has joined in this evening that we welcome you to Palmer Memorial Episcopal Church's Great Wednesday webinar series. This has been such a wonderful surprise during this season of COVID and quarantine. And tonight we are thrilled to welcome Joy Harjo as our guest this evening. And I'm going to share an introduction here, give you some information about Joy, and then as I've done in the past, I will hop off of here. But if you have a question for Joy or for Neil, please send those directly to me through the chat box, and I will take care of those, or through the question box. And so let me do the introduction now. And Joy, welcome. Joy Harjo, the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States, is a member of the Muskogee Nation and belongs to Hickory Ground. She is only the second poet to be appointed a third term as U.S. Poet Laureate. Born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, she left home to attend high school at the innovative Institute of American Indian Arts, which was then a Bureau of Indian Affairs school. Harjo began writing poetry as a member of the University of New Mexico's Native Student Organization, the Kiva Club, in response to Native empowerment movements. She went on to earn her MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop and teach English, creative writing, and American Indian Studies at University of California, Los Angeles, University of New Mexico, the University of Arizona, Arizona State, University of Illinois, University of Colorado, University of Hawaii, Institute of American Indian Arts, and University of Tennessee, while performing music and poetry nationally and internationally. Harjo is the author of 9 books of poetry, including her most recent book of poetry, An American Sunrise, which came out in 2019. It was a 2020 Oklahoma Book Award winner. She's written Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which was shortlisted for the Griffin Prize and named a notable book of the year by the American Library Association. Her other books, In Mad Love and War. Her first memoir, Crazy Brave, was awarded the PEN USA Literary Award in Creative Nonfiction and the American Book Award. And her second, Poet Warrior, a memoir of which we will speak about some this evening, was released this fall. A couple of other details that I want to share is that, give me one second here. There's so many amazing things. Harjo performs with her saxophone and flutes, solo, and with her band, the Aerodynamics Band, and previously with Joy Harjo and Poetic Justice. They have toured across the United States and in Europe, South America, India, Africa, and Canada. Harjo has produced 7 award-winning music albums, including Winding Through the Milky Way, which she was awarded a NAMI, N-A-M-M-Y, for the Best Female Artist of the Year. And her latest album is I Pray for My Enemies. Lastly, in addition to serving as a 3-term U.S. Poet Laureate, Harjo is a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, holds a Tulsa Artist Fellowship, directs For Girls Becoming, an arts mentorship for young Muskogee women, and is a founding board member and chair of the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. She has recently been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Philosophical Society, the National Native American Hall of Fame, and the National Women's Hall of Fame. She resides in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Well, folks, I think we have quite an evening ahead of us and a wonderful guest. And again, Joy, on behalf of Palmer and this community here in Houston, and we have folks from across the country joining in this evening. And so I just want to say thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, wonderful. And I'm going to now hop off and give me just one second here, and then I'm going to turn it over.
And my name is Neil Willard. I'm the rector here at Palmer Memorial Episcopal Church, and I want to welcome everybody who's going to be a part of this conversation tonight. It may not be very surprising to hear from someone who's dressed like I am that I not infrequently think of poetry as a kind of prayer. And it would be an honor to talk to you any time of the year. But, in our context, I think it's a special honor to talk to you in the season of Advent as we're in the weeks leading up to Christmas, because I feel like a lot of the themes that come up in Advent that we reflect on each year often lend themselves to kind of a poetic expression. And so that could be, something about hope, or hope for ourselves, hope for the people who are around us, hope for the world in which we live. Or it could even be like looking around at that world, lamenting the suffering that we see and crying out to God. It might be a plea for God to come quickly and help us, or at least to want to feel that God is presence near us, something like that. It might be simply sitting beside those in the shadows who are brokenhearted and excluded and weary, and giving voice to that. And I thought about a lot of those kinds of themes as I read one of your poems in the collection, An American Sunrise. It's called A Refuge in the Smallest of Places. And I wonder if I could just read that poem, then ask you something about it. And you begin by saying, for Emily Dickinson, one of the singers, and for all those fleeing on those ancient migration trails north for home. And then you say, someone sang for me and no one else could hear it. When I had given up and made knife marks on my arm, or drank and gave myself away, or was given. Someone sang for me and no one else could hear it. When demons came with rope and cages to take my children from me and imprison us. Someone sang for me and no one else could hear it. Now I am here in the timeless room of lost poetry, gathering up the destroyed and forgotten, because of the songs someone sang that no one else could hear but me. And yeah, I was really struck by that notion of hearing the songs that no one else can hear. Not unlike keeping memories of those who've gone before us, or maybe even a loved one who has Alzheimer's. It's this sacred trust. And of course, so many people in the world have no one to hear their songs or to keep their memories. Do you think of your vocation as a poet as giving voice to those kinds of songs? Or?
Well, definitely. I mean, poetry, I think of poetry as the mode of creation in which we attempt using words for what cannot absolutely be spoken in words. It's finding a language for, in a sense, finding a language for the sacred. And because we live in a world of polarity, the sacred and the profane walk side by side.
Right.
Yeah.
How did you come to be a poet, or discover that within yourself? I was thinking of how, here in our congregation, we have a composer in residence. And I've always wondered if a gift like that, whether it's composing music or it's composing poetry, is it something you simply learn about yourself, something that's already there, or is it something that you become over time through your own interest and practice? What was that like for you, or is that like for you?
I think it's different for everyone. I'm not one of these people who had a pen in my hand and started writing at 5 years old, or I was going to be an artist. And yet I came up watching my mother and listening to my mother write songs. And we had some of the finest swing bands and musicians, country swing bands at our house. And she loved poetry. And so I had a great love of poetry, that she imparted to me, but it really wasn't. And I read, so I have a poem by Emily Dickinson in that book, I'm Nobody, Who Are You?
Hmm.
But because I felt, or when I would read poetry, it was always like that voice. There was always a voice coming out of mystery, so to speak. And that's what I loved about poetry. But it wasn't until I was a undergrad student at the University of New Mexico, involved in Native rights movements, and heard and saw and met real living Native poets, and understood that no, you didn't have to be from Europe or England or New England to write poetry. Mm-hmm. That poetry could come out of my experience as a young Native woman living at that point in the Southwest.
And so was that a liberating experience? I mean,
it broke.
What was that like? What did that feel like?
Well, it broke it open. I started writing, and I was listening to a lot of poetry, and it gave me a way. It gave me a way to speak. it gave me a way to speak, and I just followed it. I've taught poetry classes. I mean, my teaching is I go in and teach for a while, and then I say I'm too busy. I had some excellent positions, but I say, okay, well, I'm sorry, I have to resign. I'm very busy. And I've been very lucky. Then people will, a few years later, will come and teach. But so I've taught a lot of students, and a lot of the young writers are really worried about finding their voice. And I never went through that. My voice is my voice. And I know if I'm going in the right direction with it, and I know when I'm going in the wrong direction with it. And I just follow it into poetry. And I don't know, I think some people have the notion that poets just get inspired and you write something out fast and there's the poem. But it's an exact art, just as you would watch someone carve, make a carving. It's the same way with poetry. I might get inspired. Most of the time I'm slogging along.
Right.
And then I start to find it. Some poems take years to write. Some I get it done mostly in a day or 2 days. I used to have a rule that I had to finish it in a day. Well, it's not that way anymore. And I pull them up now and then. And I have a new poem called Without. And that one came from, I was trying to find a poem. I was trying to find something to help me write a poem for a beloved brother-in-law who passed from COVID. And so I wrote this poem, but then I realized it's not for him. It was not for him. It was a different poem. So then I wrote one that fit his situation and fit him.
But you finished that first one that I don't know what language you would use, that you were being called to. I mean, that poem was coming forth anyway, even if it wasn't the one you thought it was going to be, right?
Right. And I have learned to follow that, because there was a period early on when I was performing, and I would have my list exactly because I was terrified. I used to have horrible stage fright. And I would, and even though my spirit might be saying, okay, say this, or, take this direction, and I wouldn't do it. And then I would feel off later. And I realized, no, that even performing, or even every moment of our lives, is like a creative moment. And
so you've learned about yourself along the way in this vocation. I mean, is that true, or is that, would you say?
I think that any of us do. I'm sure you too in your vocation.
Right.
You,
All the time.
yes, utterly. You learn utterly about yourself through your interactions
Right.
with your art, or with people, with your whatever it is we do in our lives. If we stay awake and we listen, we will learn.
So, on the theme of like, encouraging one another, and again, kind of like to the Advent thing of like wanting some kind of intervention in the world around us, wanting something to happen, and noticing suffering and that kind of thing. I was also struck in American Sunrise. You have a poem, or it's a song. It's a traditional song from the Trail of Tears that is about being together and encouraging one another. Could you say a little something about that? And what is it called? Jehoto Socrates, or I don't know if I'm not pronouncing that right.
Oh, Chihoda Charis, something like that. I usually sing it. I have.
And
Yeah, Chihodo Sakaris. Chihoda Sakaris. Yeah, that story for that is that the story behind that is that on the Trail of Tears, I mean, we were loaded up in, and I think a lot of times people think, okay, it was the Cherokees, there was one Trail of Tears. There
right.
were many Trails of Tears.
Sure.
And I have a map in that book that shows one particular one, and that was the one that was my great grandfather Menahui was on with the fish pond Miko, and the Miko is the leader. And that was the one their families traveled on, that the immigration, that was in the records of the immigration officer who led that particular group. There were many of them. And I think a lot of people in Muskogee Creek, all kinds of Navajos had a Trail of Tears, Dene people all over. And I think there's a misconception, about natives and the stereotypes that we had no culture. We were not quote unquote civilized, that we were just hiding out in the woods naked and primitive, but that is not so. We have highly developed cultures. And we had homes that were coveted by the settlers. We had been living there for years and eons. And so I read many accounts of what happened, especially when I was writing and researching an American Sunrise, where settlers would come in and natives were, pushed out by gunpoint and would just go into the houses and keep pianos, libraries.
Right.
And natives were forced out with just what they could carry and walked. And I had a great uncle, I think it's four great uncle, who was down in the Columbus, what's now called Columbus, Georgia area, who owned the largest horse racing establishment on the Eastern Seaboard. He was moved too. Everybody was
Right.
moved. Your money didn't make any difference. It had to do with you being native and those lands. The Removal Act was about people wanting those resources. I mean, the same thing kind of how it happens now.
Sure. And you're right. I'm from North Carolina, so I always think of the Cherokee whenever I hear about that. Would you be comfortable singing that song, or?
Yeah, I can sing it.
Okay.
I don't know. Singing, the sound quality isn't great over Zoom.
That's
Chihoto Chazari Chiho Oh Lakari Mo Mais Komet Awajkan Away Yakatlis Holwen, which is basically telling people, the story goes, there was a respected older woman at the front and one towards the back, and they would call out and sing this song so that people were able to keep going, which is like basically hang in there, don't get tired. We're going to be determined, and we'll all get to the highest place together.
It's in a very different context. The thing about going up higher, or the reference to the highest place, reminded me of, like, in the Book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible, about Psalms of Ascent, pilgrims singing together as they go up to the temple. And thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I have another question about thinking about, again, in my context, this coming Sunday is the fourth Sunday of Advent, and not this year, but next year on the fourth Sunday of Advent, we'll be having a reading in our public worship from the Gospel of Matthew about Joseph receiving a message in a dream and telling him not to be afraid to get married to Mary and to name her child Jesus. And I love what the biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann says about dreams. And he writes, we do well in our management while we are awake, and we keep the light, power, and control on 24/7, except, of course, that we must sleep. We require seasons of rest and therefore vulnerability. Our control flags. We become open to stirrings that we do not initiate. Such stirrings come to us in the night unbidden. Dreams address us. They invite us beyond our initiative-taking management. The ancient world and the biblical tradition knew about dreams. The ancients understood that the unbidden communication in the night opens sleepers to a world different from the one they managed during the day. The ancients dared to imagine, moreover, that this unbidden communication is one venue in which the holy purposes of God, perplexing and unreasonable as they might be, come to us. And I was just wondering, like, what do you think about dreams? I think I've heard you talk about this in other places.
Well, I mean, we're actually, you could argue that we're dreaming now. We're live in a malleable world, and we're constantly uh, acting with it. You might call it imagination, but it's, at every moment we're taking the stuff of dreams, of memories, and, allowing them to, sometimes they shape our lives. But I always have this sense that when I pass, I've kind of seen it or experienced it. It will be like I'm standing out, and it's like a chapter, and I look at it, and it feels like a dream that I have just been in the dream. And so my dreams have always been very active. Some of them are like waking dreams. And
Mhm.
there's even a moment in time where I was helping people who passed, helping them to the other side in that space, in that dream
Right.
space. And I think that any creative artist, or maybe philosopher, or anyone who reads and thinks and is open to or pays attention to the natural world, understands that, or understands the possibility of that, because we are in a very vibrant, always changing worlds, and our words make a difference, our intent of our words, of course our actions, and they all become part of a story, or even, you could even say, a prayer.
Right. Does your practice, I mean, obviously writing poetry is care for words, and, has that shaped how you use words outside of the act of writing poetry, or, um,
I think they're all related. I talk about one of my mentors, Audre Lorde, in my new memoir, Poet Warrior, and I remember her telling me that there is no separation between your personal life
hmm.
and, what you do, your work. There's not, it's really all the same.
Let me ask you something else about kind of the communities in which we live. So, like here at Palmer on a Sunday, in our worship services, there's usually a part where we start saying one of the ancient creeds of the church with the words, "We believe." And I love that for a lot of different reasons. And it's partly because it's what a whole community is saying together, but then also partly because individuals who are struggling with something, whether it's their faith or something else going on in their life, they can be carried along by the voices and the prayers of the rest of the community. And that's one of the things that I really love about inviting people into that kind of language. They are part of the great we that begins, in that example, a statement of belief, even if they happen to be struggling with belief. And, in that sense, is that sense of we important in the various communities to which you belong? And that inform the poetry that you write? And does that we go far beyond those who surround you in your own generation? In other words, is it both horizontal and vertical?
I think so. I mean, I think that, there's a misconception about indigenous peoples, and we're not just one group, but,
Right.
very many different groups, is um, that we're primitives, or, unless we have the religion, the different systems that mark European and other cultures, that we're not quote civilized, or not full human beings. But what I have noticed is that I'm thinking about the we,
Yeah.
is that, at times of ritual and ceremony, all people are acknowledged,
Mhm.
all peoples. It's not just, well, this is just us, or just this, but we are all here, we are all part of the same, we all come from the same place. We
You're
were
talking about a universal kind of
Right, we were created not by a creator who wants to punish us, but we were
Mhm.
created by Anagechka, or love.
Mhm. Well, I want to ask you one very simple question here, sort of in the middle of our conversation. Okay, between us, how does one become the poet laureate of the United States? Does the phone just ring out of the blue and a stranger surprise you with the news?
Sort of, but kind of, but in the poetry world, we all pretty much know each other.
Right.
And so Rob Casper, who was the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress, we all know him, and that office is responsible for at least helping with the poet laureate position. The head librarian chooses the poet laureate. But I knew that I had a new book coming out, and so he sent me a quick message and said, I have a quick question. I have one short question for you. Can you talk at this time? And I said, sure. And so I figured National Book Fair Festival, my book. So I call at that time, or he calls me, and I said, hey, Rob, how you doing? He says, hang on a minute. You're on speakerphone. That's odd. Next thing I know, Dr. Carla Hayden is at telling me they want me for the 23rd U.S. Poet Laureate.
Wow. What did that, the first time, what did that feel like?
Like lightning.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't expect it. I didn't expect. I had a weird feeling, though, that something was up, but I just, reasoned my way out of that.
When you're, that going back to the we question, perhaps even unexpectedly when that's happening, did you have the sense of being surrounded by the great we?
Well, I think it's I see all of our positions as positions of service.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're the king, the president, right, whether you're the person sweeping the hallways to clean them, they're all service positions. And that's how, I think all kinds of things began running through my mind, and I was thinking about responsibility, but at the same time, I realized, I see the position as like being an ambassador of poetry and holding the door open, in American poetry at this particular time. And so that's how I did say yes. But I was thinking, one of the thoughts that ran through is, oh my God, you're already overbooked and too busy.
Right.
I had just told my booking agent, I don't want to do any more interviews. I want to back off on, I want to start painting again. I've got this musical to write. And then wham, it was, well, yeah.
If a librarian calls me, I'd be terrified that I had an overdue book. So I'm thrilled. What a wonderful way to have that surprise. That's great. In your most recent book, Poet Warrior, I thought it was interesting. You said that you're obsessed with maps and directions, and you have this one little section, but then you turn to talk about. I didn't expect you to immediately turn and talk about an internal map for yourself. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was kind of an interesting part. And you said that at least at the time that you wrote it, you said it looked something like this. East, a healer learns through wounding, illness, and death. North, a dreamer learns through deception, loss, and addiction. West, a musician learns through silence, loneliness, and endless roaming. South, a poet learns through injustice, wordlessness, and not being heard. Center, a wanderer learns through standing still. Is that still a fairly accurate description of your internal map, or does that change from time to time?
That's a literary version.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have you ever helped people kind of map out their internal, help them describe what would be an internal map for themselves, or do you just think poetry does that on its own?
I think poetry does it on its own. I think part of what I'm doing is, in my poetry, is trying to map the soul. Mm-hmm. Really, that's kind of what I'm about in some way, and what I'm doing is to map that, to see what that looks like.
Do you ever go back to something that you wrote years earlier in thinking about how we have different chapters of our life, and we have all kinds of experiences, good and bad, that happened to us along the way? And do you ever go back to something you wrote or an old poem and rewrite it for a new chapter, even if it's a different poem in that sense, or do you just leave things as they are?
I usually leave things as they are. A lot of times I'll revise, or they'll turn up in other editions of my book revised, other editions, and then audience members it'll make them upset or nervous. Why did you change
Right. Sure.
a lot of those changes come from performing. So when you
Yeah.
first put a book out, usually if it's all new material, just like an album, you put
Right.
out an album of music, you write an album of music, you put it out. And then when you go out and perform it, you get to know the material.
Sure.
And then you revise it according to, you find where, what works better here and the expression of it. So it's kind of like that, but no, I don't go back and rewrite poems.
Do you thinking of how people experience poems? I don't know if how this comes up when you've taught about it or whatever. I think I heard an interview with Christian Wyman of Yale Divinity School talking about encouraging students to try to go into a room by themselves to make sure that they read poetry aloud rather than silently. Do you ever talk to people about that, about different ways of experiencing a poem that they might not? I mean, it may be obvious, but they might not do it without the suggestion.
Well, I the first time I had an assignment of memorization, I was a visiting writer at University of Montana. And I had the students, it was only 8 lines then. I had them memorize 8 lines. I made everybody put their books down around the circle. It was a graduate seminar.
Right.
So there wasn't a whole classroom of students. And we went around the table, and it was so powerful. Everybody was really struck by that. And I remember how powerful that was. And then a few years later, I was teaching at UCLA, teaching a class it was a literature class called Decolonizing the American Mind. And it was really a study of some contemporary American poets. And for their midterm, I assigned 100 words of memorized poetry from someone they'd been studying, and then a short paper on why that particular poem and a discussion of that poem. Well, you would have thought I had told them I said, it could be worse. I play that a lot.
Right.
I almost had you memorize 300 lines. So 100 lines. And anyway, I had people coming to my office, and worried about it. But it took 2 days because it was a larger class, and everybody did. It was actually quite beautiful. And the way I figure it is that, you might leave school, at least they would have something.
Sure, they take that with them, right?
They take it with them.
It is interesting too how you experience it. I mean, this comes up in worship services in a setting like the Episcopal Church. On the one hand, we want to print the words so people will have them and they take them with them, and maybe they'll think about them in a certain way. But on the other hand, you kind of want people in the initial part, you kind of wish that the words weren't there so that they would just look up and listen. And then maybe get the words later, but we haven't figured out how to quite do that smoothly. But people do experience things in a different way. There's where their attention is drawn, and
that's true. It's like you experience an event much different. If you're holding a camera, there's a certain in your cameraing or imaging,
right?
It in a way it's another viewpoint on the story, but you're not you're no longer the participant that you were. And I've noted that too. There's a lot of poems I know by heart and others almost. And I always think it would be better if I knew all of them, because, or like music, it's much better if I know my song, because then I have more freedom.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
To move with the material. And so, yes, I prefer that. I know several of my poems by heart, but yeah, there's something about that experience. The first person I heard do their whole set by heart was, of course, the young spoken word poets, but the poet Galway Cannell. I heard him and just declaim his poetry is beautiful.
Another thing that's in your most recent book, Poet Warrior, that caught my eye was you mentioned that there are many different kind of genealogies. You were just talking about family history earlier, but then you talk about these other kind of genealogy, which I thought was a really interesting image. And you said among those within your own family are a genealogy of rage and a genealogy of justice. Could you say something about those, and maybe there are other kinds as well?
Yeah, I was just kind of riffing when I wrote that,
Right.
but it was intriguing because like you, I think, okay, a genealogy of rage, where would that start? Who are the predecessors
Right.
and what sparked, what sparked it? How did it come about? What's the origin story? You know.
Have you have others talked to you? Like, I don't know if you've discussed this in a class or anything, and it's helped them kind of visualize some things about themselves or their past or sort of where they come from, or
No, I haven't used that. I
yeah,
haven't been teaching for a while.
interesting.
Yeah, I haven't been. Well, I've done a lot of video, a lot of Zoom,
Right.
and so that becomes my teaching in a way. I'm actually going to be doing, I think, the first poetry workshop at in years at Wake Forest, I think
Oh,
in early
that's where I
February.
went to college. So that's great.
It's a 3-day thing. I usually say no to those kinds of
Right.
things.
Okay. Well, I will have to find out about that. Let me ask you about the poem that I read that moved me the most. And I just want to talk about the context of this. And during the season of Advent, this time of the year, daylight hours, become fewer, and a lot of people they tend to think about loss over the past year, and those who won't, maybe for the first time, be physically present at upcoming holiday gatherings or at kind of celebrations, whether that's a worship service or some other kind of gathering. And you have this really powerful poem, again, in Americans and in the book An American Sunrise, about your mother.
Mhm.
And it's too long to read the whole thing, but just the first section, the opening section, is just strikes such a powerful spiritual chord for someone like me. And I think for a lot of the people, certainly in my congregation, or and do you want to read this first section? I don't mind reading it either, but I don't
I
know
can read
would
it.
you be this
I'm
first
looking.
section, this is the introduction.
I'm looking for the page now. I'm
Oh,
trying.
it's page 30.
Right, I thought it was earlier on. Yes, this is a long poem, and I really wanted to wash my mother's body because I stayed with her. I was there. I helped her over. I midwifed her, I say,
Right.
and helped her over to the other side. And yet other family, before I knew it, I didn't even get a chance. These strangers came into the house wearing suits, and they took her. So I guess it did bother me, but I also didn't want to cause a disturbance at such a
Right.
tender moment because, as we know, those moments of transformation, birth, death, marriage, adolescence, becoming, changing form, are full of danger, even as they're full of tenderness, of immense tenderness. And I didn't want to disturb that. So I didn't argue and let her go. And so I guess I was writing along. I was in a different mode, researching and writing about another whole part of my family. And this poem emerged. So I'll just read a few sections in here. This poem taught me is that you can, if you have had a disagreement with someone or there was something that you regret, you don't have to let it go. Even if the person passes on, you can still, that essence of that story remains, and you can still speak to them. You can still go back. You can write it in a way, write a story, write a poem, and go back and have an effect on that time, place, memory. I never got to wash my mother's body when she died. I returned to take care of her in memory. That's how I make peace when things are left undone. I go back and open the door. I step in to make my ritual, to do what should have been done, what needs to be fixed so that my spirit can move on, so that the children and grandchildren are not caught in a knot of regret they do not understand. And then I'll read this other little section. As I wash my mother's face, I tell her how beautiful she is, how brave, how her beauty and bravery live on in her grandchildren. Her face is relaxed, peaceful. Her earth memory body has not left yet. But when I see her the next day, embalmed and in the casket in the funeral home, it will be gone. Where does it go? It is heavier than the spirit who lifted up and flew. I think of it making the rounds to every place it has loved to say goodbye. Goodbye to the house where I brought my babies home. She sings goodbye to June's bar, where I was the shuffleboard queen. I cannot say goodbye yet. I will never say goodbye.
Thank you for reading that. And the other sections that we didn't have time to read, you go on to describe what you would be thinking if you had been able to wash her by, what you are thinking as you write those words, as you pick up a white enamel pen, take a bar of soap into your hands, wring out the washcloth, and so on. And it's such a powerful way of describing that, and really something that immediately caused me to think about things in my own life, or just experiences that I have. Like, as you say, you can step into those, you think they're gone or whatever, but you can step into those and reflect on them, or respond in a way that you wish you had responded. It's just an interesting, I'm just going to be thinking about that for a long time. So thank you for that gift.
Thank you. Yeah, that poems are kind of rituals. I think of them that
Right.
way. There's the title that welcomes you in, or it's the doorway. And every line, every word has to have a place. It has to have a function. And then it moves you through an opening and through some kind of, and again, all kind of poetry is all different, but it moves you through a space. And when you walk out, I always want people to walk out with something, walk away with something, with a gift. And I never know what that is when I'm writing, because I find it too as I write.
Right. Someone wants to know, someone's asking about this, and your use of the number 7 as a sacred number. So I don't know about that, but someone's asking about that.
Okay, my take on that is 7. There's the 4 directions, and then there's 4 inside, 5 outside, above, below. Okay, so there's 4, 5, 6, and then inside 7.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's how I think of it. Then I also think of it as an encapsulation of 4, which has to do with stability, and the 4s, 4 directions, 4 seasons, and so on, as well as 3 plus 3. I mean, there's different computations of,
Right.
make up, but I like thinking of it as 4 and 3, so that you have that stability. At the same time, there's the mobility that a 3 has, which moves in a different kind of way than a more stable kind of figure is 4. That's my.
Thank you. There's been a request for a specific poem from An American Sunrise, the one called Singing Everything on page 53. Mm-hmm. Someone wondered if you wouldn't mind reading that one.
Okay, Singing Everything. Once there were songs for everything, songs for planting, for growing, for harvesting, for eating, drink, getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, mind break, and war. For death, those are the heaviest songs, and they have to be pried from the earth with shovels of grief. Now, all we hear are falling in love songs and falling apart after falling in love songs. The earth is leaning sideways, and a song is emerging from the floods and fires. Urgent tendrils lift toward the sun. You must be friends with silence to hear. The songs of the guardians of silence are the most powerful. They are the most rare. And it's true, in our tradition, there are songs for everything. And I think it's because songs, the effect of words with singing has more power, often has more power in the sense that they can move. It's easier for them to move, or for words to move into different places.
Do you find that, now you made me think about, even again, the difference between reading a poem, hearing a poem, or singing a poem? For some people, it's not our tradition in our church here to, again, go back to the creed, to sing the creed, but I worked in a church and seminary that did a West Indian Anglo-Catholic parish. And I can still remember the opening parts of it, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible. And there's something about doing that, that for some people, if they struggle with just saying the words, it's easier for them to sing them.
Mhm.
And I don't know what that is, but do you find that to be true, or at least that it helps people, that it puts it in a different place in their spirit, or how they're thinking about the words?
I think so, something like that. I mean, I think of healers in our
Mhm.
different indigenous traditions, and a lot of the healers is a word for, I know for some of there's different kinds of medicine people, but I was around the Navajo a lot, and Hatatli was a word for one. It's the singer, essentially. And in our people, I mean, there's songs, there are songs for everything. And I remember watching, I read something or watched where this young man had been showing around this botanist in his territory. And the botanist, the guy was very impressed. And he says, wow, he says, you know so much about these plants. He says, no, but I don't know their songs yet.
Oh, what a beautiful way of phrasing that.
Mhm.
You
And
know,
then,
you know,
yeah.
like when you're walking around and you encounter something like that, I have no idea. Do you have a little notebook where you write down things like, that catch you unawares if you're talking to people, or?
Mhm.
um,
I do. I've got little notebooks everywhere. Write write
Are
down.
you able to keep them organized, or this sort of just?
No, no, I've got them everywhere. I mean, I'm pretty organized. I'm
Right.
organized, but I just, I really admire people that maybe they buy all moleskins and they date them perfectly, and have,
Right.
have even a little index and they're all in a row, and that's not me. There's different there's
Sure.
moleskins, but I write. I don't always have, care. Sometimes I have one in my pocket, a small one, but I like the large. I like having the space to write larger.
Have you ever had the experience? I mean, I've had this happen to me, where I rediscover something that I wrote years ago, and I'm almost surprised that I wrote it, or I think, wow, I actually wrote that, or I didn't remember, I'd sort of forgotten about it, and I read it. Do you ever have like a rediscovery of something, or?
Yeah, I'm going to read this new poem because it was
Okay.
like that. That was the one I was
Right.
talking about at the beginning, and I realized it wasn't the poem. But this one came from that. I was going through some old notebooks, like from a ways back, and I found some of this poem about 5 or 6 lines. I mean, I revised them. I thought, whoa, that's a good poem. And I went and looked, and then I revised it. I revised it thinking of someone's death, and then it turned
Mhm,
into kind of a love poem, but
mhm,
a love poem thinking of my husband, but also at the same time, it was like this feeling we're getting, coming in at this part of the time and, the longest nights and
mhm,
wondering about where we are and where we're going and then thinking of death without.
mhm.
The world will keep trudging through time without us. When we lift from the story contest to fly home, we will be as falling stars to those watching from the edge of grief and heartbreak. Maybe then we will see the design of the two-minded creature and know why half the world fights righteously for greedy masters and the other half is nailing it all back together through the smoke of cooking fires, lovers' trysts, and endless human industry. Maybe then, beloved rascal, we will find each other again in the timeless weave of breathing. We will sit under the trees in the shadow of earth's sorrows, watch hyenas drink rain, and laugh.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, when you were talking earlier about, thinking about death, I sort of stand in this strange place where, I'm surrounded by a world in which I live. On the one hand, people are constantly avoiding talking about death or thinking about it. On the other hand, I'm in a vocation where I think about death every day.
Mhm.
And then I'm also surrounded in this setting, across from the largest medical center in the world, by life and death. And you cannot help but notice it, and the life flight helicopters come every day. And how does that kind of sense, whether it's in your vocation as a poet or in your identity, the communities to which you belong, how is that woven into a part of just what it means to live in this world?
Well, it's all such a part of it. I think
Mhm.
poets, of course, poets have always veered toward
Right.
veered toward the unanswerable questions. So
Mhm.
it's always been a purview or, of poetry. But I think of poetry being written, certainly we write with words, but I think we also write with time and
Mhm.
timelessness. And so, it's always, it's always a presence.
With respect to poets, and I don't know the world of poetry, but I think of like a lot of hymn writers in Western Christianity. Not a few of them wrote out of great suffering, and you may not see that in the words, but that's sort of where it comes from. And all is that true of poetry, or at least some poetry, or what? How common is that?
I think that, that's how we gain wisdom. Our
Mhm.
muscle, spiritual muscle, is through challenges. And it's not because God or the creator is being, it's sort of like tests for your doctorate degree or or whatever
Right.
degree that you're, that you gain muscle, you gain muscle by working the muscles, by challenge. And so to be challenged is a tremendous gift. And sometimes those challenges nearly break us.
Mhm.
I also think about how much there is that we don't understand, that we will never
Sure.
quite comprehend evil and the
Mhm.
presence of evil. And there are some things I think that we'll never understand until we have the kind of context that comes from uh, other experiences of time and resonance. I think what's helped me in a lot of ways towards understanding, or in my process of becoming human, is being a very young mother and a very young grandmother.
Mm.
And now I have great grandchildren, and there's something about that point of view that has given me, different points to stand on and view the story field, than if I had not gone through what I've gone through. And if, you know, it,
Mhm.
I had some of those points of view when I was very young.
I love that you mentioned mystery before. I mean, I certainly, in my own context, which is a little different than some other forms of Christianity, that sense of mystery is really important to the way I express that, the way we do worship here. And I think actually, the older I get, the more I appreciate that. The more I realize how little I know, and
Mhm.
that's okay. And I have sort of a trusting, a relationship to that knowledge, and it's a really important part of my spiritual life. And it's not something that I would say I'm afraid of. It's actually something that comforts me, that being embraced by that mystery. So, um, is that something that you reflect on a lot? Just about, again, the things that we don't know, the mysteries of the world around us, or
I think so. When I write, that's where I'm going.
right? And what about, you mentioned wisdom before, and I know Oprah Winfrey asked you this question. What would be your definition of wisdom? How would you define wisdom?
How would I define wisdom? Did she ask me that?
She did ask you that as a.
Well,
I
then
was
what did
intrigued.
I say? What did I say?
Well, I was just thinking. Of course, I don't have the answer right in front of me, but it was about, again, because it just resonates with kind of how my own spiritual life. You said something about realizing that you're not limited by the present time.
Mhm.
Again, kind of going back to that sense of the great we, both horizontal and vertical, that you're a part of something much larger, and that
Mhm.
those things are real. You're not just limited to what you can see right in front of your nose.
Yeah, and that's why we need the arts and artists
Right.
and what they bring, whatever art it is, because that's how artists work in that field. That's the materials. Those are the materials of the artist, or even the philosopher, or the searcher.
Great. I'm looking to see if we have any other questions that have come in. What's something that are there projects that you're working on now?
I'm always working on things. Well, I finally got the title. I realized that it's been 50 years since I started writing. My first poem was published 50 years ago next year. So quickly I schemed. I wasn't scheming. I thought, why not a book of poetry of 50 poems?
Oh yeah, sure.
Years. And then I wrote notes for those poems in the back, which I just finished. And we were trying to find a title, because I didn't want to just call it 50 poems. I took part of a line from a poem for Alba May Benson, and it's called, I think we're calling it Weaving Sundown Against Scarlet Light, 50 poems and 50 years, or 50 years and 50 poems, one way, something like that. But I'm working on a musical. It's not a traditional Western musical, and more music and some poetry, and so on. Oh, I see somebody asking about reconciliation.
Yeah. Do you believe you found reconciliation with your family?
Oh, I love my family. We don't always agree, nor do we always get along, but that's just part of it.
Well, I want to tell you thank you again, and Neil, thank you. But Joy, thank you so much. Hearing your song, hearing your voice, hearing you read your poems was just a beautiful gift that I personally will carry with me forward. And I just absolutely love the fact that you don't remember the question Oprah asked you. And I will just carry that forward with me, because that's just fantastic.
And zone there, you don't meet Oprah every day. I was in a
That's right.
Well, I mean, even though, right, you don't meet her every day. And the fact that, I don't remember the question she asked me. I think that's pretty amazing. But again, I do want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in this evening for this webinar. And again, what a gift. And again, on behalf of Palmer and the staff and the community here, we thank you, and we thank everybody who tuned in this evening. And we hope everyone has a special season, a holy season, as we close out this year and prepare to enter into a new season, hopefully with lots of brightness ahead of us. And so thank you all, and look forward to next time when we gather like this. We're going to be gathering in January, the end of the month. If you're interested in learning more, it is already posted on our website, and you can go ahead and register for Padraig Otuma, another poet who will be a wonderful voice to lead us into the new year. So again, thank you. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Blessings. Bye-bye.